70 something or another. $10 for bread and eggs. Jeff.
Heard from one woman who even said that the same basket of groceries that she regularly buys has now effectively doubled.
Now we're looking at an average of $14, $13.50 a pound, except for chicken. That's on sale. Turkey, I mean.
More than 60% of American households do not earn enough to maintain a minimal standard of living, according to a newly released report. This means the majority of U.S. families cannot consistently afford basic needs, such as food, housing, healthcare, childcare, and access to essential technology for work and education. This is not about comfort or luxury, it's about survival-level stability.
Move down the tariff levels. Both sides on the reciprocal tariffs will move their tariffs down 115%.
Even after the United States and China agreed to temporarily reduce tariffs, cutting them from a staggering 145% to 30% for a 90-day negotiation period, consumers have seen little relief at the checkout counter. Prices remain elevated across a wide range of essential goods, and major retailers like Walmart have already warned that additional price hikes are likely by the end of the month. The key question is, why haven't prices come down? The answer lies in two factors: the lingering effects of previous trade shocks and the deeper structural inflation that tariffs have helped fuel. While a 30% tariff may seem like a drastic improvement over 145%, it is still exceptionally high by historical standards. Before the US-China trade war began, the average tariff rate on Chinese goods was about 3.1%, according to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Even at 30%, tariffs remain 10x higher than pre-2018 levels, more than enough to keep prices elevated. But tariffs are only part of the story. What we're seeing now is the compounding effect of cost layers built into the supply chain. The first layer comes from inventory. Many U.S. retailers are still selling products that were imported when the 145% tariff was in effect. Since those goods arrived with high upfront costs, companies are reluctant to lower prices. Doing so would mean selling at a loss. Until that inventory clears, price tags on store shelves will remain inflated regardless of current tariff levels. The second layer of pressure comes from transportation and logistics. During the period of maximum tariff enforcement, many importers either paused or dramatically scaled back their orders from China. When the 90-day tariff pause was announced, there was a sudden rush to restock, and demand for cargo capacity spiked overnight. However, the freight sector had not yet recovered from its earlier downturn. Ports, warehouses, and trucking firms were operating with reduced staffing and resources. The result was a logistical bottleneck leading to delayed deliveries and a sharp increase in freight costs, all of which get passed on to consumers. Third, many American companies simply cannot pivot away from Chinese suppliers overnight. While policymakers often encourage diversification of supply chains, the reality is that alternative sources like Vietnam, India, and Mexico lack the capacity or infrastructure to fully replace Chinese manufacturing in the short term. Building new supplier relationships takes time, and retraining labor forces or scaling up factory output in new regions requires upfront capital and long-term planning. Things small and mid-sized firms often cannot afford. As a result, most companies remain reliant on their existing suppliers in China and must continue absorbing or passing on the costs associated with tariffs. All of these factors, high-cost inventory, inflated shipping, inflexible sourcing, combine into a situation where price reductions are slow, if not impossible, to realize in the short term. In fact, by the time a consumer sees a product in store, the final price may reflect not just the tariff, but multiple inflationary pressures stacked on top of each other. A 30% tariff at the border might ultimately translate to a 60–70% price increase by the time the item reaches the shelf, once distribution, warehousing, insurance, and risk are all factored in. Even if tariffs were to disappear tomorrow, many American households would still feel financially stretched. That's because beyond trade policy, the U.S.'s economy is now shaped by persistent structural inflation and a new era of elevated interest rates, both of which are quietly but powerfully reshaping how Americans live and spend. In a recent speech, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell acknowledged a shift that has been building since the pandemic. We are no longer in a world where inflation is too low. For much of the 2010s, the Fed's challenge was to stimulate inflation and avoid deflation. Today, it faces the opposite problem, managing price growth that remains stubbornly above target even as the economy slows. Powell's comments suggest that the Fed's benchmark interest rates will likely remain high for longer, signaling a fundamental policy shift. This has real-world consequences. Higher interest rates directly increase the cost of borrowing for households. That means more expensive mortgages, auto loans, student debt, and credit card interest. For businesses, higher borrowing costs reduce investment and make it harder to manage short-term cash flow, which often leads to slower hiring, fewer pay raises, and conservative pricing strategies that protect margins rather than expand access. Inflation, while cooling compared to 2022 peaks, is still embedded in everyday expenses. The Consumer Price Index (CPI) for essentials like shelter, food, utilities, and transportation remains significantly elevated compared to pre-pandemic levels. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, shelter costs alone increased over 6% year-over-year in early 2025, one of the largest contributors to the overall CPI. Meanwhile, wage growth has lagged behind, especially for lower and middle-income workers, creating a widening gap between what people earn and what their lives actually cost. One of the most troubling aspects of this economic environment is how it interacts with the pressures described in the previous section. The tariff-driven price increases, for instance, are magnified by the fact that people are paying more just to access credit or recover from existing debt. If an American family needs to put groceries or back-to-school supplies on a credit card, they're now facing interest rates well above 20% in many cases, meaning even basic spending becomes a long-term financial burden. What makes this especially challenging is that policy tools are limited. The Federal Reserve can raise or lower interest rates to influence inflation, but it can't control global supply chains, fix trade disputes, or legislate wage growth. Meanwhile, political efforts to ease the burden, such as temporary tariff reductions, are often short-term and unpredictable, providing little assurance to households planning for rent, healthcare, or education costs. This dynamic creates a kind of perpetual financial fog for most Americans. There's no clear path to affordability, no stable benchmark for what things should cost, and no reliable sense of when or even if relief will come. That uncertainty is just as damaging as inflation itself. It makes people cautious, anxious, and less willing to spend or invest in their future. For millions of Americans, the result is a quieter, slower erosion of financial security, not through layoffs or crashes, but through relentless cost pressure and shrinking buying power. In this new economic reality, inflation isn't just a temporary spike. It's a feature of the system now, and unless interest rates fall or wages rise in step, most Americans will continue to find that hard work no longer guarantees a livable life. The current economic pressures facing American households didn't appear overnight. They are the result of systemic vulnerabilities that have been building for years, long before the pandemic inflation or the 145% tariff shock. What we're witnessing now is not just the fallout from a specific crisis, but the unraveling of an economic system that was never designed to handle so many simultaneous stressors. At its core, the U.S. economy has long depended on low inflation, cheap global imports, and easy credit to sustain consumer purchasing power. This model worked to an extent when interest rates were near zero, wages were stable, and supply chains flowed uninterrupted from Asia to America's ports. But it also masked deeper fragilities: stagnant real wages, a shrinking middle class, and an over-reliance on just-in-time supply chains that offered no slack when disruptions hit. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 exposed many of these weaknesses. Factories closed, shipping routes slowed, and product shortages spread. But instead of rebuilding with greater resilience, the system rushed to return to normal, a normal that depended heavily on fragile global sourcing and razor-thin margins. Then came inflation, and then the tariffs. The economic architecture simply couldn't absorb it all. When the Trump administration imposed a 145% tariff on Chinese goods in early 2025, it wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a stress test. And the system failed. Supply chains snapped, businesses panicked, shipping volumes plummeted, then surged, and infrastructure from ports to trucking firms couldn't keep up. What should have been a temporary policy shift triggered a cascade of consequences: inventory shortages, inflated transportation costs, and ultimately higher prices that landed squarely on American consumers. Even the attempt to reverse course, the 90-day tariff reduction to 30%, did little to calm the system. Businesses flooded ports with orders hoping to capitalize on the lower rate. But logistics networks had already scaled down. Warehouses were full of unsold high-tariff stock. Truckers had been laid off. Containers were in the wrong places. The system was built for efficiency, not flexibility. And when disruption hit, it buckled. This lack of built-in resilience isn't just about supply chain. It's also embedded in labor markets housing healthcare and education. Workers who face rising rent and medical costs can't easily relocate or retrain when industries shift. Small businesses already operating on thin margins don't have the financial cushion to absorb even short-term shocks. Government safety nets are piecemeal politicized and often slow to respond. What's become clear is that the American economic system was optimized for speed and growth, not for stability or equity. It could function under favorable conditions, but when faced with sustained inflation, elevated borrowing costs, trade shocks, and political unpredictability, it began to fracture. The result is what we're seeing now, a population that is still working, still spending, but increasingly unable to afford the basics of modern life. This isn't a temporary moment of pain. It's a long-term exposure of the imbalances that were always there made visible by crisis. Without meaningful structural reform in supply chains, wage policy, tax structures, and trade strategy, these cracks will continue to widen, leaving more families priced out of stability and more companies playing defense rather than investing in the future. At first glance, it may seem like the U.S. economy is in disarray, buckling under the weight of inflation, policy missteps, and trade shocks. But look closer, and a more sobering truth emerges: the system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as it was built to. This economic model, one that prioritizes global efficiency over domestic stability, corporate margins over worker security, and short-term gains over long-term resilience, has produced predictable outcomes. For decades, it has delivered growth, innovation, and wealth creation for a narrow segment of society while leaving the majority increasingly vulnerable to the smallest disruptions. The current affordability crisis isn't an accident. It's a consequence. When 60% of Americans can no longer afford a minimal quality of life as defined by access to housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and digital connectivity, that is not simply a sign of inflation. It's the reflection of policy choices that span decades. Tariff reductions, interest rate adjustments, and stimulus debates may dominate the news cycle, but they are treating the symptoms, not the disease. The real issue is that the American economic framework was never recalibrated for an era of global volatility, rising inequality, and climate-driven supply disruptions. It still operates under assumptions that no longer hold that goods will always be cheap, that growth will trickle down, and that families will adapt without support. This is why prices remain high, not just because of supply shocks or import taxes, but because the system was never designed to absorb those shocks in a way that protected working households. Uncertainty, delay, and cost pass-throughs aren't malfunctions, they are built-in features. Please comment below for more breaking news.